The call for help. John Blake sat in his small, cluttered office, staring at the flickering screen. The hum of old machines and the smell of stale coffee filled the air. A feeling of desperation gripped him as he reviewed his work orders. Each project that had come across his desk recently had been a disaster. Tools that didn't fit, parts that didn't work, designs that fell apart in the final moments. John was no longer the engineer he once had been. In fact, he had become the engineer no one wanted. His reputation was on the line. No one wanted to hire him anymore, not after the last job had failed. He had put in months of hard work, only for the project to collapse in front of investors, leaving him with nothing. His savings were drained, and the bills kept piling up. There were no jobs, no calls, no opportunities. The future seemed like a dark, endless tunnel with no way out. But then, on that quiet, uneventful day, everything changed. The message came through as a simple, unremarkable alert. A standard communication from a client requesting repairs, or so John thought. But when he opened the message, his eyes widened in disbelief. The name of the sender didn't register at first. The Alien King's warship repair request flashed across the screen. John blinked, rubbed his eyes, and stared again. His first instinct was to dismiss it as some sort of scam or prank. Why would anyone want a human engineer to repair an alien warship? He almost clicked the delete button but hesitated. Something about the message caught his attention. It was urgent. And the location. A derelict alien ship at the edge of the galaxy. John had seen many odd things in his career, but nothing like this. The alien warship in question had been abandoned for centuries. It was once a symbol of great power, a majestic vessel built for war, floating in the far reaches of space. The king who owned it had mysteriously disappeared, and the ship had remained a ghost, its technology too advanced and alien for anyone to understand. Most engineers feared even approaching it. The message was simple. We need you. Fix the ship, or it will be lost forever. Payment upon completion. John's mind raced. This could be his chance. If he repaired this ship, the reward could be unimaginable. Wealth, fame, perhaps even a fresh start. But doubts crept in. The ship was in a dangerous part of space, far from any human colony. And it wasn't just any ship. It was an alien warship, abandoned by its king and untouched for years. He stared at the screen, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. No one else had answered the call. Other engineers had turned it down, terrified of the unknown. But John had nothing left to lose. The thought of returning to his old life, scraping by on odd jobs, was too much. He had to take this risk, no matter how dangerous it seemed. John made up his mind. He hit the accept button. Moments later, a hologram flickered to life in front of him, projecting a stern alien face. The hologram was a message from the Alien King himself, though it seemed to have been recorded long before John had even received the request. The king's voice was cold, and the tone of the message left a chill in the air. You are human. You are skilled. Fix my ship and bring it back to its full power. If you succeed, you will be rewarded beyond imagination. Fail, and you will be forgotten. Do not delay. Time is running out. John didn't fully understand the implications of the message, but the desperation in the king's voice was unmistakable. It was clear that something important was at stake. His mind raced as he prepared to board the shuttle that would take him to the ship. Packing his things, John realized that this was his only chance at redemption. But doubts crept into his mind. What if the ship was cursed? What if the alien technology was too advanced for him to handle? What if he was walking into a trap? Despite the fear gnawing at him, he set his mind to the task. This was his last shot. As the shuttle launched from the Earth station, John's heart pounded in his chest. The vast emptiness of space surrounded him, and the distant stars seemed to mock his isolation. His thoughts raced. What kind of ship was this? What had happened to the Alien King and his crew? Why had they abandoned such a powerful vessel? The trip to the derelict warship took several days, and during that time, John tried to prepare himself for whatever awaited him. He went over his plans, reviewed his knowledge of alien technology, and tried to push aside the fear that threatened to take control. When the warship finally came into view, John's breath caught in his throat. It was massive, larger than any ship he had ever seen. Its dark hull loomed against the backdrop of space, covered in strange markings and symbols. The ship was surrounded by a swirling field of debris and dead satellites, signs of past battles and conflicts. No other ships were nearby, as if the place itself was cursed. John's shuttle docked with the abandoned ship, the hatch opening with a soft hiss. He stepped into the dark, cold interior, the only sound the soft echo of his footsteps. The ship felt alive, as if it were waiting for something. The silence was deafening. As he explored the corridors, he saw signs of the ship's former glory: tall, alien architecture, intricate designs, and technology beyond anything he could imagine. But it was also clear that the ship had been abandoned in a hurry. There were broken control panels, damaged walls, and strange scorch marks along the floors. It looked like a place that had been through war, a place where lives had been lost. John took a deep breath. He had no idea what had happened here, but one thing was certain: he was alone. And he had no choice but to repair the ship and face whatever dangers it might hold. The call for help had been clear. Now it was up to him to answer it. The abandoned ship. John stood still for a moment, his breath heavy in the cold, metallic silence of the alien warship. The faint hum of ancient engines echoed in the distance, but there was no sign of life. The air was stale, thick with the dust of forgotten battles and long-abandoned technology. As he stepped deeper into the ship, the shadows seemed to stretch, twisting around him like dark, watchful eyes. The eerie stillness felt almost unnatural, as if the ship was holding its breath, waiting for something. The warship's size was overwhelming. Endless hallways and massive chambers stretched out before him, all adorned with designs he couldn't comprehend. There were symbols glowing faintly on the walls, alien scripts he couldn't read. The architecture was both beautiful and terrifying. Sleek curves, sharp angles, and towering structures. It was a far cry from the crude, blocky ships humans had built. This was something ancient, powerful, and far beyond human technology. John's heart raced, and for a moment, doubt began to creep in. Why had he accepted this job? The ship felt like a tomb, and he was intruding. The thought that he might be walking into a trap crossed his mind, but he quickly shoved it aside. There was no turning back now. If he didn't fix the ship, he wouldn't just lose his chance at a future. He'd lose everything. He made his way to the control room, following the flickering lights and strange hums that seemed to guide him. The door to the chamber opened with a soft hiss, and John stepped inside. The room was enormous, filled with alien consoles and glowing interfaces that seemed to pulse with life. At the far end of the room, a massive chair sat before a large transparent screen, its surface covered in swirling patterns and lights. The seat was clearly meant for the ship's captain, the alien king, but there was no sign of him or his crew, just remnants of what had once been a command center. John approached cautiously, his boots clicking against the smooth floor. He ran his hand along the console in front of the chair. The interface was inactive, but the markings on the screen seemed to shift ever so slightly, almost as if the ship were aware of his presence. It was a subtle movement, one that might have been easily overlooked by anyone less observant. A low growl of machinery stirred from deep within the ship, and the faintest echo of something more ancient than the ship itself seemed to hum in the background. John shook it off as just the ship coming back to life, but there was something else, a presence that felt as though the ship itself was aware of his every move. He had to focus. He wasn't here to solve riddles. He was here to fix this ship and get out before something worse found him. John activated his portable data pad, pulling up the schematic he had received from the mysterious message. The blueprint appeared, but it was anything but ordinary. The design was incomprehensible at first glance, alien systems intertwined with human-like machinery. His mind raced to make sense of it. and after a few moments of analyzing, he found the key. An engine core damaged in the lower levels of the ship. If he could get to it and repair the core, the ship's main systems would start functioning again. Then he could figure out what to do next. As he gathered his tools and prepared to head down to the lower decks, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. On the edge of the control room, tucked away in a corner, was a strange device. It looked like a console, but the design was different. The buttons were made of smooth, dark crystal, glowing faintly in a way that seemed almost alive. He hesitated. His mind screamed at him to ignore it, but curiosity won over. He approached the device slowly, reaching out to touch one of the glowing crystals. The moment his fingers made contact, the entire room seemed to shift. The walls hummed, a low vibration running through the floor, and the air thickened with an unnatural weight. Before John could react, the lights around him flickered, and a deep, resonating voice filled the room, booming from nowhere. "Why have you come?" The voice was not human. It was alien, ancient, and filled with a weight that made John's chest tighten. The words seemed to vibrate in his bones, echoing through the walls of the ship. His heart pounded in his ears. "What do you seek?" John stumbled backward, his mind racing for an answer. He knew he had to respond, but the question was too much. Was this the ship's consciousness? Was it alive, or was he losing his grip on reality? I came to fix the ship," John stammered, trying to steady his breath. "I was asked to repair it." The room fell silent, but the eerie hum continued to pulse in the background. The air felt heavier, as if something was watching him from the darkness. Then the voice spoke again, but this time it was different, softer, almost sorrowful. "Repair it," the voice echoed, as if it were considering his words. "The ship cannot be repaired. Not by you. Not by any being of flesh. Its fate is sealed, as is mine. But you may try, and suffer the same fate as those before you." John's stomach churned, his instincts screaming at him to leave. But the job wasn't done. He couldn't walk away. The voice had said it could not be repaired, but that didn't mean he shouldn't try. He had come this far. He couldn't turn back now. He swallowed hard, summoning all the courage he had left. "I'll fix it," he said firmly, more to himself than to the ship's mysterious voice. "I won't give up." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the voice returned, softer this time, almost resigned. "Very well. You may try. But know this, not all things are meant to be fixed, and not all that is broken can be mended." John stood frozen, the weight of the words sinking into his bones. The ship seemed to hold its breath once again, and John realized something. It was no longer just a machine he was dealing with. The ship was alive, or at least it had been. And now, it was a ghost, haunting its own halls. Something had broken it, something beyond what John could understand. And whatever that something was, it wasn't finished with him yet. With a final glance at the dark corners of the room, John turned away from the mysterious device and headed toward the lower levels. The ship was waiting for him to fix it, but John couldn't shake the feeling that the ship might have other plans for him, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face them. The alien king's legacy. John moved quickly, his pulse racing. The ominous voice that had filled the room still echoed in his mind, lingering like a shadow. The ship was alive in ways he couldn't understand, and it seemed to know more than he ever could. But there was no turning back now. He had accepted the task, and if he didn't finish it, he would be trapped here forever, just like those before him. He continued through the narrow, dimly lit hallways, following the flickering lights that led him toward the lower levels. The strange, alien energy that seemed to hum through the walls kept him on edge. The ship felt like it was watching him, waiting for something. The deeper he ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. He could feel the weight of centuries pressing down on him, like the ship itself was an ancient tomb that had been disturbed. Eventually, he reached the lower decks. The air was thicker here, cooler, almost stagnant. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols he had seen earlier, glowing faintly but erratically. Some of the markings were scratched, others seemed to have been burned into the metal, leaving permanent scars. Whatever had happened to this ship, it hadn't been a peaceful end. John could feel it in the cold air around him. He found the engine room just as the schematics had promised. It was enormous, far larger than anything he had ever seen, an entire chamber dedicated to a single engine core. The core itself was a massive glowing orb suspended in the center of the room. It pulsed with an eerie blue light, sending waves of energy through the room, distorting the air around it. John approached cautiously, marveling at the sheer scale of the machinery. The engine was both beautiful and terrifying, with intricate alien designs covering every inch of its surface. He could barely make sense of the technology, but he could tell it was more advanced than anything humanity had ever created. He wasn't sure where to start. This wasn't like fixing a broken generator or rewiring a control panel. It was an entire system, something far beyond human understanding. Suddenly, a low rumble shook the ship, sending a shudder through the floor. The hum of the engine grew louder, the energy increasing with each passing second. John looked up, alarmed. The core was reacting to something, maybe to his presence, or maybe to something else entirely. Before he could make sense of it, the room darkened. The glowing lights around the engine dimmed, and the atmosphere grew heavy, as if something was descending into the room. Then the voice returned, this time more urgent, more desperate. You do not understand what you are dealing with, human. This ship, this core, it is not just a machine. It is a prison, a weapon, a legacy of the king's ambition. And you will never leave until you accept that fate. John's heart skipped a beat. The words were chilling, but he couldn't back down now. He couldn't fail. He had already come too far. Who are you? John asked, his voice steady despite the growing fear in his chest. What happened to the king and his crew? For a long time, there was only silence. Then, with a sound like a distant sigh, the voice spoke again, its tone dark and filled with sorrow. I am the king's final command. I am all that remains of him and his people. We were once rulers of this galaxy, feared and respected. The ship you now stand on was a symbol of our power, a weapon forged in the fires of countless wars. But we were betrayed, and this ship became our prison. John felt a cold shiver run down his spine. The king's words carried weight, a history of pain and loss that had been sealed within the ship's walls. He tried to keep his focus, but the ship felt like it was alive, like the walls were closing in on him. The king's enemies turned on him, seeking to control the power of this warship for themselves. They unleashed horrors upon us, monsters that tore through our ranks, until the ship was abandoned in fear and chaos. The engine you now see is the heart of the ship, the last remaining source of its power. It is not just a machine. It is a part of the king's soul. John's mind raced as the truth began to sink in. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was alive, infused with the spirit of the alien king. And whatever had happened to the king had left this place cursed, a graveyard for his fallen crew. He took a deep breath and approached the core. He couldn't understand all of the alien technology, but he knew one thing for sure. He had to fix it. If he didn't, the ship would fall into oblivion. And worse, it might fall into the hands of whoever had betrayed the king and killed his crew. As he worked, a sudden sharp sound broke the silence, a door opening behind him. He turned quickly, his heart pounding, but there was no one there. Only the faint echo of footsteps on the metal floor. John froze. He wasn't alone. The ship was alive, yes, but now something more sinister had awakened. He could feel it, the presence of something or someone watching him. The ship was not just a mechanical prison. It had become something worse. It was a trap. And he was the bait. You are not alone, human, the voice whispered, its tone colder now. The king's enemies are still here, and they will not let you leave. John's hands shook as he worked to repair the engine. The voice, now twisted with anger, seemed to pulse with the energy of the ship itself. The engine hummed louder, the lights around him flickering wildly. And then, without warning, the doors to the engine room slammed shut, locking him inside. Panic surged in John's chest as he realized the full extent of what he was up against. The ship wasn't just cursed, it was alive, and it had no intention of letting him go. The awakening of the past. John's breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as the heavy doors of the engine room slammed shut behind him. A resounding metallic clang echoed through the chamber, sealing him inside. The lights above flickered violently, casting erratic shadows across the cold, gleaming walls. The hum of the ship's core had turned into a deafening roar, pulsing in sync with his racing heartbeat. Something had changed. The atmosphere had shifted. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He was no longer just a repairman fixing a broken ship. He had become part of something far older, far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The voice that had guided him before was now silent, replaced by an ominous, heavy presence that seemed to stretch throughout the entire ship. He could feel it, a growing sense of dread pressing in from every corner. The King's enemies have awakened. The voice finally spoke again, its tone colder than before. And now, they will come for you. John froze, his hand still hovering over the control panel. The repairs were almost complete, but the ship was no longer responding in the way it should. The machinery seemed to be fighting him, as if resisting his touch. His fingers trembled, and he forced himself to take a steadying breath. He had to finish what he started. If he didn't, he would never leave this place. But then, the ground beneath him trembled. A low, guttural growl filled the air, vibrating through the floor and walls. It wasn't the ship's engines. This was something else, something living. The room plunged into darkness. The humming of the engine ceased abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence. Then a sound, like a whisper, but not from the voice he had heard before. This one was much more primal. "You have no idea what you've awakened, human," the voice hissed, its tone dripping with malice. "You should have never come here." The air around John grew cold, and the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. He could see his breath fogging in the dim light as he backed away from the central core. His mind raced. Was the ship itself threatening him, or was something else at work here? The walls seemed to close in on him, and he could hear the faint sound of movement, like something was shifting just beyond his vision. And then he saw it. A shadow moved in the corner of his eye. Fast, too fast to be natural. John whipped around, but nothing was there. Just the empty, eerie silence of the chamber. Yet the feeling that he was being watched, stalked, became undeniable. The presence was real. It was like the ship had turned against him. And worse, he was not alone. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, growing from a murmur to a guttural snarl. It came from the very walls themselves. The air thickened, and John realized with a sinking feeling that the ship was no longer simply malfunctioning. It had been taken over by something. A low, screeching noise echoed from the depths of the ship, and the floor beneath him vibrated once more. The walls began to tremble violently, as if the ship were alive. The rumbling grew louder, and then, from the shadows in the far corner of the room, emerged the first of them. A creature, its body long, segmented, and covered in thick, black scales, slithered from the darkness. It had no eyes, but its mouth was filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth, glistening in the faint light. Its movements were quick, fluid, and disturbingly precise, like it had been waiting for this moment. It hissed, the sound resonating through the room like a warning. John stumbled backward, his hand reaching for his blaster, an old human model. But it felt hopelessly inadequate against the monster that now approached him. The creature's mouth opened wider, revealing more teeth as it closed in. But before it could strike, another movement caught John's eye. Something larger, more imposing, appeared from the shadows behind the creature. The air seemed to warp around it, its form massive, with shifting, impossible contours. This was no beast. It was something far worse. An alien warrior, clad in armor that seemed to shimmer and flicker like it was from another time. Its face was covered by a dark helm, but John could sense the intensity of its gaze. Its presence was overwhelming. The creature hissed again, but this time the armored figure raised a hand, stopping it in its tracks. The monster backed off, retreating into the darkness as if it recognized the command. The figure spoke in a voice that was deep, resonant, and unsettlingly calm. "You have awakened the remains of the king's enemies, human." The voice was full of ancient authority. "But you are not ready for what comes next." John stood frozen, struggling to process what he was seeing. The being before him was like nothing he had ever encountered. Its movements were graceful but powerful, its posture regal in a way that seemed to defy all logic. It exuded a quiet power, like it was a part of the ship, perhaps even more than the ship itself. The creature stepped forward, its boots clicking against the metal floor with each movement. As it neared, John could feel the ship itself trembling. His hand tightened around his blaster. This was no ordinary alien. It wasn't just a guard or a soldier. It was something much older, much darker. "You must leave now, human. The king's ship is no place for the likes of you. It will consume you, just as it consumed all others." The word sent a chill down John's spine. For the first time since stepping aboard the warship, he felt the weight of his situation. This was no mere salvage job. It was a cursed mission, and now the price for his intrusion was becoming clear. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I can fix this. I've already started the repairs. The ship can still be saved." The armored figure's helmet tilted, almost as if it was considering his words. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's failing engines. "No, it is beyond saving. The ship was once a tool of power, but now it is a tomb. And you are in the wrong place at the wrong time." John swallowed hard. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. But he wasn't about to give up. Not yet. His hand shook, but his resolve hardened. He had come this far. There was no way he was leaving without a fight. "I'm not leaving. Not until I fix it. Whatever you are, whatever the ship is now, it doesn't matter. I'm finishing what I started." The figure stood motionless, its dark presence heavy in the room. Finally, it spoke one final time, its voice like a death sentence. "Then prepare yourself, human. The past will not let you go." And with that, the shadowy figure vanished into the darkness, leaving John alone in the cold heart of the alien warship. But he wasn't truly alone anymore. The ship had awakened. And so had its secrets. The king's last will. The armored figure took a step forward, its form casting a long, imposing shadow across the cold metal floor. John's heart raced, but his hands remained steady on the controls. He couldn't let fear take over now. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. The ship, the creatures, the mysterious voice. None of it made sense, but there was one thing John knew for sure. If he didn't finish repairing the ship, if he didn't complete the task, everything would be lost. The armored figure spoke again, its voice low and ominous. "The king's will is final. You should not have come here, human. The ship is not just a weapon. It is a prison, and its curse cannot be undone." John's mind raced as he tried to process the words. A prison? The king's curse? What did it all mean? The feeling of being watched intensified, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to leave before it was too late. But he couldn't. Not yet. "I don't care about curses," John said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I was hired to fix this ship, and I will fix it. I'm not leaving without doing what I came for." For a long moment, there was silence. The armored figure seemed to study him, its helmet reflecting the flickering light of the engine core. Then it spoke, its tone surprisingly calm. "You are brave, human, but bravery does not always lead to survival." John squared his shoulders, the determination in his eyes evident. I've survived worse." A faint, almost imperceptible sigh echoed from the figure. The king was once a ruler of galaxies, feared by all. But his enemies were many, and his ambition led to his downfall. The ship you are standing on was his pride, a weapon of unimaginable power. But the power it holds is not meant for mortals like you. The king's enemies unleashed monsters upon this ship, horrors that are bound to it, bound to the very core of its being. John's mind whirled. Monsters, he muttered, his thoughts racing. Those things, the creatures. Yes, the figure replied, its voice tinged with a hint of sorrow. The king's enemies were not just other species. They were creatures of pure darkness, beings from beyond the stars. They were unleashed upon this ship, and they destroyed everything, including the king's own people. The ship became a tomb, and the monsters became its guardians. John's throat went dry. It was worse than he thought. The monsters, the strange presence he had felt earlier. Everything was part of the same twisted story. The ship, once a symbol of power, had become a prison for those who had betrayed the king, as well as for those who had once followed him. The king's own legacy had become a trap. "So what do you want from me?" John asked, his voice harsh with frustration. "I'm just a man. I'm not some soldier, not some savior. I'm here to fix the ship. That's all." The armored figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering John's words. "You are not just a man, human. You are the first to enter this ship in centuries, the first to awaken it from its slumber. And now you will face its final test. The king's enemies, those that still linger, will not allow you to leave. They will hunt you down, just as they hunted the king and his crew." John clenched his fists. He couldn't allow himself to be afraid. He had a job to do. The king's ship, the engine, it was all tied together, and the core was the key. "You said the king's enemies were here," John said, trying to stay focused. "Are they still alive?" A pause, then a chilling response. "No, but their presence remains. The king's enemies have been sealed within the ship. Their souls, their power, are bound to the core. And now, they will test you. They will rise again, and you will have to face them. Only then will you truly understand the cost of repairing this ship." The words hit John like a slap. The king's enemies weren't just dead. They were part of the ship. They were still here, still waiting. And whatever it was that had cursed this place, whatever force had bound them to the ship, was still active. "I don't have time for riddles," John snapped, his voice sharp. "I'm here to fix the core. I don't care about curses, ghosts, or whatever this ship is hiding. If I don't fix this, everything's going to fall apart." The armored figure stepped closer, its form looming over him. Its voice dropped to a near whisper. "You think you can repair it? You think you can fix what has been broken for so long? The ship is beyond saving. And so are you." John's hands tightened around the tools in his grip. He couldn't back down now. He had made it this far. "We'll see about that." The figure raised its hand, and the entire room seemed to shift. The walls groaned, and the air became thick with tension. For a moment, the space felt like it was warping, as though the very fabric of reality was stretching and bending. The hum of the engine grew louder, almost deafening, as if it were responding to the figure's command. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. A chilling wind swept through the chamber, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. John shivered, but he didn't move. He had to finish what he started. Then, from the shadows, a new sound emerged, soft, at first, like a whisper, then growing louder, until it became a roar. The floor beneath him trembled. "The test has begun," the figure intoned. John turned toward the source of the sound. From the darkness of the engine room's farthest corner, shapes began to emerge, slowly, like they were being pulled from the very walls. Dark, writhing forms, flickering in and out of reality, their grotesque bodies twisting as they approached. "You cannot outrun them, human," the figure warned, its voice almost sympathetic. "The monsters have been waiting for you. The ship has been waiting for this moment." John didn't hesitate. He sprinted for the nearest exit, his pulse pounding in his ears. The creatures, whatever they were closing in. The room was alive with the sound of their movement, the very air heavy with their presence. As he reached the door, the figure's voice rang out one last time, filled with a finality that chilled him to the bone. "You cannot escape the past. Human, you will face it, and you will face the king's judgment." And just as John reached for the door's control panel, the first creature lunged from the shadows, its jaws snapping. It was too late to turn back now. The battle for the core. John's breath hitched as the room seemed to come alive around him. The air turned icy, his every exhale visible in the freezing atmosphere. The lights flickered, dimming to almost nothing, then suddenly flaring back to life, casting long, grotesque shadows across the walls. The warship seemed to groan under the strain, as though something deep within it was stirring, something ancient and powerful. The armored figure didn't move. Its presence was like a still force in the center of the chaos, watching John with an unsettling calm. "You do not understand, human," it intoned again. "The king's enemies were bound to the ship, bound to the core. They will rise again, and you will face them, or you will die trying to fix what cannot be fixed." John didn't respond. He was too focused on the growing presence of something darker. A low, resonant growl echoed through the floor, shaking the very foundation of the ship. The walls trembled, and a violent surge of energy sparked from the core, sending a flash of light through the chamber. The ship was alive in a way he couldn't fully grasp, like a living, breathing organism with a pulse of its own. From the far side of the room, a dark form began to emerge from the shadows. At first, it was barely visible, like a faint ripple in the air, but soon it solidified into something horrific. A hulking figure, tall and grotesque, with skin like cracked stone. Its eyes glowed a sickly green, and its mouth was lined with rows of jagged teeth, dripping with an eerie black ichor. John instinctively reached for his blaster, but it was too late. The creature lunged forward, its powerful limbs closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. Without thinking, John ducked, narrowly avoiding the monster's claws as they slashed through the air with inhuman speed. The creature snarled, snapping at him, its growl vibrating the air. But John had no time to process the shock. He had to keep moving. He dived behind a control panel, trying to steady himself. The blast doors were still shut, trapping him inside the engine room. The monster was relentless, circling him, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. John's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly assessed the situation. The repair tools scattered around the room. His only hope were all at least a few feet away, and the blaster wasn't enough to take down something like this. Then the armored figure's voice rang out from behind him. "It will not be so easy. The king's enemies are not meant to be defeated by simple weapons. They are born from the core itself." John's mind raced. The core. That was it. The energy in the room, the growls of the monster, the strange power, it was all tied to the core. If he could fix it, if he could stabilize it, maybe he could stop whatever had been unleashed. As if sensing John's thoughts, the monster roared, its voice guttural and distorted, and charged again. This time, John was ready. He vaulted over the panel and sprinted toward the core, dodging another strike from the creature's claws as it swiped wildly at him. But just as he reached the core's central console, another figure emerged from the darkness. This one taller, its body more elongated, with tendrils of smoke trailing from its form. It was an ethereal being, glowing with an unholy light, and it seemed to flicker in and out of existence, a second enemy. John's mind screamed in panic, but his body reacted without hesitation. The blaster in his hand was a useless tool now. What he needed was the core's energy. He reached out, connecting his tool with the ship's main system. The controls flickered under his touch as he activated the emergency override. The core's energy surged violently, flaring up with intense blue light. The chamber lit up, casting grotesque, shifting shadows as the monsters closed in. The armored figure spoke again, but this time, its voice was quieter, almost regretful. The king's enemies were not meant to be defeated by force, but by understanding. The ship, the core, only one who can unlock the power within can hope to stop them. You must face the king's legacy head-on. John's hands moved with precision, despite the growing sense of dread that clung to him. The control panel blinked with alien symbols, each one more complex than the last. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to focus, remembering every lesson he'd learned about ship mechanics and repair. The core responded, its energy amplifying, as if it were feeding off John's actions. The glowing symbols on the walls intensified, spiraling outward like veins of light, connecting the ship to the very core of the warship. John had no idea what he was doing, but he could feel the energy. Pure, unyielding power, coursing through the ship. The monsters snarled, agitated by the increasing energy. The armored figure, still watching, remained silent. Suddenly, the creature closest to John roared again, more furious than before, its claws reaching out with unholy speed. But in that moment, the core pulsed again, stronger than ever, and a blinding light enveloped the room. The monsters screamed, their forms distorting, flickering as though they were being pulled into the very walls. They writhed, their bodies stretching and twisting as they struggled to break free from the force binding them. The shadows that had once seemed to move independently were now retreating, sucked back toward the core as if the ship itself were rejecting them. The air in the room hummed with a strange, otherworldly energy. For a moment, everything went silent. John stood frozen, struggling to process what he was seeing. The being before him was like nothing he had ever encountered. Its movements were graceful but powerful, its posture regal in a way that seemed to defy all logic. It exuded a quiet power, like it was a part of the ship, perhaps even more than the ship itself. The creature stepped forward, its boots clicking against the metal floor with each movement. As it neared, John could feel the ship itself trembling. His hand tightened around his blaster. This was no ordinary alien. It wasn't just a guard or a soldier. It was something much older, much darker. You must leave now, human. The king's ship is no place for the likes of you. It will consume you, just as it consumed all others. The word sent a chill down John's spine. For the first time since stepping aboard the warship, he felt the weight of his situation. This was no mere salvage job. It was a cursed mission. And now the price for his intrusion was becoming clear. John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I can fix this. I've already started the repairs. The ship can still be saved. The armored figure's helmet tilted, almost as if it was considering his words. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's failing engines. No, it is beyond saving. The ship was once a tool of power, but now it is a tomb. And you are in the wrong place at the wrong time. John swallowed hard. This was bigger than he could have ever imagined. But he wasn't about to give up. Not yet. His hand shook, but his resolve hardened. He had come this far. There was no way he was leaving without a fight. I'm not leaving. Not until I fix it. Whatever you are, whatever the ship is now, it doesn't matter. I'm finishing what I started. The figure stood motionless, its dark presence heavy in the room. Finally, it spoke one final time, its voice like a death sentence. Then prepare yourself, human. The past will not let you go. And with that, the shadowy figure vanished into the darkness, leaving John alone in the cold heart of the alien warship. But he wasn't truly alone anymore. The ship had awakened. And so had its secrets. The king's last will. The armored figure took a step forward, its form casting a long, imposing shadow across the cold metal floor. John's heart raced, but his hands remained steady on the controls. He couldn't let fear take over now. He had come this far. and there was no turning back. The ship, the creatures, the mysterious voice, none of it made sense, but there was one thing John knew for sure. If he didn't finish repairing the ship, if he didn't complete the task, everything would be lost. The armored figure spoke again, its voice low and ominous. "The king's will is final. You should not have come here, human. The ship is not just a weapon. It is a prison, and its curse cannot be undone." John's mind raced as he tried to process the words. A prison? The king's curse? What did it all mean? The feeling of being watched intensified, and every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, to leave before it was too late. But he couldn't. Not yet. "I don't care about curses," John said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "I was hired to fix this ship, and I will fix it. I'm not leaving without doing what I came for." For a long moment, there was silence. The armored figure seemed to study him, its helmet reflecting the flickering light of the engine core. Then it spoke, its tone surprisingly calm. "You are brave, human, but bravery does not always lead to survival." John squared his shoulders, the determination in his eyes evident. "I've survived worse." A faint, almost imperceptible sigh echoed from the figure. The king was once a ruler of galaxies, feared by all. But his enemies were many, and his ambition led to his downfall. The ship you are standing on was his pride, a weapon of unimaginable power. But the power it holds is not meant for mortals like you. The king's enemies unleashed monsters upon this ship, horrors that are bound to it, bound to the very core of its being. John's mind whirled. "Monsters," he muttered, his thoughts racing. "Those things, the creatures." "Yes," the figure replied, its voice tinged with a hint of sorrow. "The king's enemies were not just other species. They were creatures of pure darkness, beings from beyond the stars. They were unleashed upon this ship, and they destroyed everything, including the king's own people. The ship became a tomb, and the monsters became its guardians." John's throat went dry. It was worse than he thought. The monsters, the strange presence he had felt earlier. Everything was part of the same twisted story. The ship, once a symbol of power, had become a prison for those who had betrayed the king, as well as for those who had once followed him. The king's own legacy had become a trap. John stood there, his hand tightening around the control panel. The thought of leaving crossed his mind, of walking away from this cursed, haunted ship. He had come here as an engineer, just doing his job, never expecting to be caught up in something this vast, this ancient. But now he saw the potential. The ship had been freed from its past, and perhaps he could do something with it. He wasn't just an engineer anymore. He had become something else, a part of the ship, a part of its story. The king's legacy could be his to command, if he was brave enough to take it. The armored figure gave one last, lingering look before turning away. "The decision is yours, human. But know this, whatever you choose, the past will always remain with you. The ship will remember." John watched the figure fade into the shadows, its presence slowly disappearing as it retreated into the depths of the warship. The silence that followed was profound, almost suffocating. The only sound now was the steady hum of the ship's newly activated engines. John stood alone, surrounded by the vastness of the ship. His mind raced with the possibilities. He could take the ship back to Earth, perhaps use its power for the betterment of humanity, or he could leave it behind, return to his life, and forget everything that had happened here. But as he looked around the room, at the ship's powerful, glowing core, he knew there was no turning back now. He had become part of this ship's legacy. And with that, John made his decision. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, his hand reaching for the central console once more. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he was ready. The warship, with all its ancient power, was now in his hands, and he would be the one to decide what to do with it. As he activated the engines, the ship roared to life once again, its engines humming with a newfound purpose. The king's legacy, long lost to time, had found its new commander, and humanity had just gained a power like no other.